The woman limping through the pre-dawn darkness of the Haute-Loire Valley on September 23, 1943, carried 40 pounds of plastic explosives strapped beneath her coat. Her left leg, the artificial one she called Cuthbert, ached where the leather socket pressed against the stump just below her knee. She had been walking for 6 hours through occupied France, and the prosthetic limb that the Gestapo had dismissed as a cripple's handicap was about to become her greatest asset in a campaign of sabotage that would paralyze German supply lines across central France. Virginia Hall was 37 years old, an American working for Britain's Special Operations Executive, and she had just received orders to coordinate with French resistance cells in destroying the railway infrastructure that fed Wehrmacht divisions fighting in Italy and preparing for the inevitable Allied invasion of France. The Germans had posted her photograph in every police station and Gestapo office from Paris to Lyon. They called her the Limping Lady. They considered her the most dangerous of all Allied spies. They had no idea she was already moving through their occupied territory, recruiting saboteurs, and planning a series of demolitions that would demonstrate how a single determined agent with proper training and support could create strategic chaos far beyond what her physical limitations suggested possible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The railway line she was surveying that morning ran from Lyon through Le Puy-en-Velay toward the Mediterranean coast. German freight trains used this route to move ammunition, fuel, and replacement parts to divisions in southern France and northern Italy. The tracks crossed dozens of bridges, wound through mountain passes, and depended on signal stations and switching yards that were vulnerable to someone who understood both demolitions and the psychology of guerrilla warfare. Hall had studied both at the SOE training facilities in Scotland, where instructors had initially questioned whether a woman with a prosthetic leg could handle field work. She had proven them wrong by outperforming able-bodied male recruits in navigation, weapons handling, and the peculiar skills required for living under cover in enemy territory. Her wooden leg was a liability in some ways. It slowed her walking speed, it made long marches excruciating, it limited her ability to run if pursued. But it also provided perfect cover. The Gestapo and Wehrmacht security forces were looking for dangerous Allied agents. They were not looking for a middle-aged American woman who walked with a pronounced limp and claimed to be a journalist, or a farm worker, or any of the other identities Hall adopted as she moved through occupied France. German soldiers at checkpoints saw the limp, saw the obvious difficulty she had moving, and assumed she posed no threat. They were wrong. By October 1943, Hall had established contact with multiple resistance groups in the Haute-Loire and Creuse departments. These were not the organized military units that some histories romanticize. They were farmers, teachers, railway workers, and shopkeepers who had decided that collaboration was unbearable and that resistance, however dangerous, was necessary. Many had no military training. Few had access to weapons or explosives. What they did have was local knowledge, commitment, and now, with Hall's arrival, technical expertise and access to British supplies dropped by parachute in nighttime operations coordinated through coded BBC radio broadcasts. The organisation that trained Virginia Hall and sent her into occupied France was created out of desperation and necessity. The Special Operations Executive came into existence in July 1940, after the fall of France left Britain without allies on the European continent and with no conventional means of striking back at German occupation forces. Prime Minister Winston Churchill's directive to the newly formed organisation was characteristically blunt: set Europe ablaze. The SOE would conduct sabotage, organise resistance movements, gather intelligence, and create chaos behind enemy lines where conventional military forces could not reach. The SOE's training programme, conducted at requisitioned country estates in Scotland and southern England, was unlike anything in traditional military education. Recruits learned silent killing techniques, lockpicking, forgery, sabotage, and the specific skills needed to survive while living under false identity in occupied territory. They studied explosives in detail, learning how different compounds behaved, how to calculate charge sizes for specific targets, and how to construct time-delay detonators from available materials. They practiced railway demolition on British rail lines, learning exactly where to place charges to cause maximum damage while using minimum explosives. The curriculum emphasized psychological preparation as much as technical skill. Instructors taught recruits how to maintain cover stories under interrogation, how to recognize Gestapo surveillance techniques, and how to live with the constant awareness that capture meant torture and execution. The Germans did not treat SOE agents as prisoners of war entitled to Geneva Convention protections. They treated them as spies and saboteurs, subject to immediate execution or transfer to concentration camps. Every agent who parachuted into or infiltrated occupied Europe knew the risks. Railway sabotage became a central focus of SOE operations in France for strategic reasons that were clearly articulated in planning documents. The German military depended entirely on rail transport to move the massive quantities of supplies required by divisions spread across occupied Europe. A single Wehrmacht infantry division in combat consumed approximately 200 tons of supplies daily, including ammunition, food, fuel, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. Moving that tonnage by road was impossible given fuel constraints and the limited number of trucks available. Railways were essential. The French rail network was particularly important because it connected German industrial centres with occupation forces in France, Wehrmacht units fighting in Italy, and coastal defences being constructed along the Atlantic Wall in preparation for the Allied invasion everyone knew was coming. Disrupt the railways. And you disrupted everything. Ammunition did not reach artillery batteries. Fuel did not reach tank units. Replacement parts for damaged vehicles sat in warehouses instead of reaching maintenance depots. German divisions became progressively weaker, not through direct combat, but through the cumulative effect of supply disruption. SOE planners calculated that a successful railway sabotage created effects far beyond the immediate damage. Destroying a locomotive meant that locomotive was out of service for months, requiring specialized repair facilities and replacement parts that were increasingly difficult to obtain as Allied bombing destroyed German industrial capacity. Destroying a bridge meant traffic had to be rerouted over longer distances, consuming more fuel and creating bottlenecks at other choke points. Even temporary disruptions forced the Germans to divert security forces to guard railway infrastructure, pulling troops away from frontline duties. Virginia Hall lost her left leg in December 1933, years before the war, in a hunting accident in Turkey, where she was working for the American Consular Service. She was 27 years old, ambitious, and fluent in French, German, and Italian. The shotgun discharged accidentally. The pellets struck below her knee, and gangrene set in before she could reach proper medical facilities. Surgeons amputated her left leg below the knee at a hospital in Istanbul. The injury ended her diplomatic career. The State Department had regulations prohibiting foreign service officers with physical disabilities from serving overseas. The prosthetic leg she received was a crude device by modern standards. It consisted of a wooden shaft, a leather socket that fit over the stump, and a system of straps and buckles that held it in place. The foot was rigid, offering no flexibility or shock absorption. Walking required a distinctive hip-swinging gait to compensate for the inability to flex the artificial ankle and push off with the toes. Long distances caused the stump to swell, making the socket painfully tight. The leather rubbed and chafed, creating sores that could become infected. In wet conditions, the leather absorbed water, becoming heavy and causing the straps to stretch, which made the leg unstable. Hall named the prosthetic Cuthbert, treating it with the dark humour that people who live with permanent disabilities often develop. She learned to walk with it, then to climb stairs, then to manage rough terrain. Physical therapy in the 1930s consisted primarily of determination and practice. There were no sophisticated gait analysis systems or custom orthotic fittings. You received a prosthetic leg, you adjusted the straps until it stayed on, and you learned to walk through trial and error. When war broke out in Europe in September 1939, Hall was living in Paris, working as an ambulance driver for the French army. She evacuated wounded soldiers during the German invasion in May and June 1940, witnessing firsthand the collapse of French resistance and the efficiency of German military operations. When France surrendered on June 22, 1940, Hall refused to accept defeat. She made her way to London and volunteered for any organisation that would send her back to fight. The SOE initially rejected her application. A woman with a prosthetic leg seemed unsuitable for covert operations in occupied territory. Hall persisted, arguing that her languages, her knowledge of France, and her ability to blend into civilian populations made her valuable despite her disability. She also pointed out what should have been obvious. The Germans would not suspect a limping middle-aged woman of being a dangerous Allied agent. The SOE reconsidered and sent her to training. At the SOE facilities in Scotland, Hall proved herself through sheer determination. She completed forced marches carrying full packs. She learned to parachute, though the landing impact on her prosthetic leg was excruciating. She mastered Morse code, learning to transmit and receive wireless messages at the speeds required for covert communication. She studied demolitions, memorizing the properties of different explosives and learning to calculate charge placements. Instructors noted that she never complained about the leg, never asked for accommodations, and never failed to complete an assignment regardless of physical difficulty. The SOE infiltrated her into France in August 1941, more than 2 years before her campaign in the Haute-Loire. She spent 15 months in Lyon, organizing resistance networks, arranging safe houses for escaping Allied airmen, and transmitting intelligence back to London. The Gestapo eventually identified her, forcing an escape across the Pyrenees into Spain in November 1942. The mountain crossing nearly killed her. The prosthetic leg was never designed for that kind of terrain, and the journey took days through snow and ice with inadequate food and constant fear of capture. Hall returned to France in March 1943, this time working for the American Office of Strategic Services after transferring from British SOE. The OSS assigned her to the Haute-Loire region with specific objectives: organize local resistance groups, coordinate supply drops, and conduct sabotage operations against German communications and transportation infrastructure. The region was strategically important because railway lines running through the department connected Lyon with the Mediterranean coast and provided supply routes to German forces in southern France and Italy. The explosives Hall received came from British supplies dropped by Royal Air Force aircraft during nighttime operations. The primary explosive compound was Nobel 808, known to Allied forces as plastic explosive, or PE. This material, a precursor to the C4 explosive used in later decades, consisted of RDX mixed with plasticizers to create a malleable substance that could be shaped by hand. Nobel 808 was stable enough to be dropped by parachute, transported in backpacks, and molded into specific shapes without risk of accidental detonation. It required a detonator and primer charge to explode, making it safe to handle even under field conditions. The detonators came separately, packaged in protective containers. These were small brass cylinders, filled with primary explosive that would detonate when triggered by a time delay fuse. The time delay fuses SOE supplied were ingenious devices, simple enough to be used by untrained resistance fighters, but reliable enough for precision sabotage. They consisted of a glass vial containing copper chloride acid, a thin wire holding back a spring-loaded striker pin, and a percussion cap that would set off the detonator when the striker was released. The acid gradually ate through the wire, and when the wire parted, the spring drove the striker into the percussion cap, which detonated the primary charge in the detonator, which set off the main explosive charge. The time delay depended on the thickness of the wire and the strength of the acid. A thin wire might part in 30 minutes. A thicker wire could hold for several hours. This meant saboteurs could place charges, activate the fuses, and be miles away before the explosion occurred. For railway sabotage, this was essential. Placing explosives on active rail lines required approaching the tracks, positioning the charges, and escaping before German security patrols or passing trains discovered the sabotage attempt. Hall taught resistance fighters the specific techniques for railway demolition that she had learned at SOE schools. For cutting rails, A charge of approximately 2 pounds of plastic explosive, properly placed, would shear through the steel. The explosive had to be molded around the rail in an inverted U-shape to focus the blast energy. A wooden form called a cradle held the explosive in position against the rail. The detonator was inserted into the explosive, the time fuse was crimped onto the detonator, and the glass vial was crushed to release the acid. Then the saboteurs withdrew to a safe distance and waited. Destroying locomotives required different techniques. The most effective method was to place charges on the steam cylinders or the boiler, feedwater pumps. Destroying either would disable the locomotive completely and require workshop-level repairs that could take months. A charge of 3 to 4 pounds was typically sufficient. The challenge was getting close enough to place the charges without being observed by engine crews or railway guards. Bridge demolition was the most complex operation. Small bridges could be dropped by cutting the support girders with properly placed charges. Larger bridges required destroying the pier foundations or demolishing enough of the superstructure to make the bridge unusable. The calculations were specific. A concrete pier required approximately 10 pounds of explosive per cubic foot of concrete to be destroyed. Steel girders required charges calculated based on the cross-sectional area and the grade of steel. Hall carried tables and formulas in her head, memorized during training, that allowed her to estimate charge requirements based on visual inspection. The resistance fighters Hall recruited had practical knowledge that complemented her technical training. Railway workers knew train schedules, security patrol patterns, and which sections of track were most vulnerable. They knew where maintenance crews stored tools and equipment that could be useful for sabotage. They knew which French railway employees could be trusted and which were collaborating with German occupation authorities. Farmers knew the terrain, the back roads, the hiding places where supplies could be cached and where saboteurs could shelter after operations. Hall coordinated between these local resistance cells and the OSS headquarters in London through wireless radio transmissions. Her radio operator, a young French volunteer, transmitted messages in code during scheduled transmission windows. The messages were brief, usually under 5 minutes of transmission time, to minimize the risk of German radio direction-finding teams locating the transmitter. Hall reported successful operations, requested supply drops, and received intelligence about German troop movements and security operations. The first railway sabotage operation Hall coordinated occurred on the night of September 28, 1943, 5 days after her reconnaissance of the Lyon-Le line. The target was a freight train carrying ammunition to German forces in southern France. Intelligence from railway workers indicated the train would pass through a specific section of track near Chamalières at approximately 3 in the morning. The section ran through a shallow cut between 2 hills, far enough from the nearest village that the explosion would not endanger French civilians. Hall and 4 resistance fighters approached the site at midnight. They carried 20 pounds of plastic explosive, detonators, time fuses, and the wooden cradles for shaping the charges. The night was moonless, which provided concealment but made working difficult. They had to feel their way along the tracks, counting rail joints to find the exact location Hall had selected during her reconnaissance. The spot had to be far enough from any switches or signals that the disabled train would not block other traffic for extended periods, which would bring massive German retaliation against local populations. They placed 4 charges on the rails, spacing them at intervals calculated to derail multiple cars. Each charge was molded carefully around the rail, the cradle was positioned, and the detonator was inserted. Hall set the time fuses for 2 hours, giving them time to reach the safe house 4 miles away. They crushed the glass vials to activate the acid, confirmed that each fuse was properly crimped to its detonator, and withdrew into the darkness. The explosion occurred at 02:53 hours. The locomotive hit the first severed rail section at full speed. The driving wheels climbed off the damaged track, the engine tilted, and the massive weight pulled it over onto its side. The tender behind the locomotive jackknifed. The first 3 freight cars, loaded with artillery ammunition, derailed and tumbled down the embankment. The impact detonated some of the ammunition, which set off a chain reaction. The explosion lit the night sky visible from villages 10 miles away. Secondary explosions continued for 20 minutes as ammunition cooked off in the wreckage. German security forces arrived at dawn to find a scene of complete destruction. The locomotive was a total loss, blown apart by exploding ammunition. 6 freight cars were destroyed. The track was torn up for 100 yards. Clearing the wreckage and repairing the line would take weeks. German authorities posted notices announcing that 10 French hostages would be executed in retaliation for the sabotage. This was standard German policy, designed to terrorize populations into refusing support for resistance activities. Hall had anticipated this. It was one reason she had selected a target far from population centers, where specific individuals could be identified and seized. The second operation came 8 days later, targeting a railway bridge over the Allier River north of Brioude. The bridge was a steel truss structure, not large enough to require massive demolitions, but significant enough that its destruction would force rerouting of all traffic through a longer alternate route. Hall surveyed the bridge during daylight, walking across it openly with the limp that identified her as harmless. She examined the connection points where the steel members joined, identifying the critical structural elements. The demolition team consisted of 6 men, including 2 railway workers who knew the bridge's construction details. They approached at night during a gap in the German patrol schedule that the railway workers had identified. The charges, totaling 35 pounds of plastic explosive, were placed on 4 main truss members. The locations were specific, calculated to cause progressive collapse when the charges detonated. Hall set the fuses for 4 hours, long enough for the team to be well clear, but short enough that no train would cross before the explosion. The bridge collapsed at 04:30 hours, dropping into the Allier River with a shriek of tearing steel. The center span twisted and fell, pulling the approach spans off their supports. When German engineers arrived to assess the damage, they found that repair was impossible. The bridge would have to be completely rebuilt, a process requiring specialized equipment, materials, and months of work. Traffic was diverted to a bridge 20 miles to the south, adding hours to every journey and creating bottlenecks that slowed the entire German supply network in central France. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Hall's third operation targeted a locomotive depot at Langeac, where German-controlled railway crews serviced engines between runs. The depot contained maintenance facilities, fuel storage, and typically held 4 to 6 locomotives overnight. Destroying the depot would eliminate multiple locomotives simultaneously and cripple maintenance capability for the entire region. The operation required precise timing and more explosives than previous attacks. Between late September and early November 1943, Hall coordinated a systematic campaign of railway sabotage across the Haute-Loire and adjacent departments that exceeded anything the Germans had previously experienced in the region. The operations followed a pattern she had refined through experience: careful reconnaissance, precise technical planning, coordination with multiple resistance cells, and rapid movement between locations to avoid German security sweeps. The fourth attack destroyed a signal station controlling traffic through a complex junction near Le Puy-en-Velay. Signal stations were force multipliers in railway sabotage. Destroying the control equipment meant that even undamaged tracks could not be used safely because train movements could not be coordinated. German railway officials had to revert to manual control, posting personnel at every switch and signal, which consumed manpower and slowed operations to a crawl. The explosives, placed inside the signal house by a resistance fighter who worked as a railway electrician, detonated during the day shift, ensuring maximum damage to equipment while allowing the French workers to evacuate before the blast. The fifth and sixth operations occurred on consecutive nights, targeting separate sections of the Lyon Mediterranean main line. Hall had divided her forces, sending teams to locations 30 miles apart to create the impression of a larger resistance organization operating across a wider area. Both operations successfully derailed freight trains. One carried tank parts and mechanical components destined for Wehrmacht armored units. In Italy, The other carried food supplies intended for German garrison troops. Neither train carried the ammunition that would have caused spectacular secondary explosions, but both created disruption disproportionate to the amount of explosive used. The German response intensified. Wehrmacht security battalions moved into the region, conducting house-to-house searches in villages near sabotage sites. The Gestapo arrested dozens of French civilians on suspicion of resistance activity. Some arrests were based on actual intelligence. Most were arbitrary, designed to terrorize populations through random violence. Hall adjusted her operations, moving deeper into rural areas and working with resistance cells that had no previous contact with each other, making it impossible for German interrogators to map the entire network, even if they captured individual members. The seventh attack was the most ambitious. Hall coordinated simultaneous demolitions at 3 different locations along a single rail line, timed to occur within minutes of each other. The operation required 3 separate teams, precise synchronization of time fuses, and careful coordination to ensure all teams could withdraw safely. The targets were 2 bridges and a long railway embankment, where cutting the rails would send trains plunging down a steep slope. All 3 demolitions succeeded. The rail line was rendered completely unusable, and repair crews had to address multiple sites simultaneously, stretching German engineering resources beyond capacity. The 8th operation targeted a railway tunnel north of Saint-Flour. Tunnels were difficult demolition targets because they required placing charges inside confined spaces where German guards could easily detect intruders. Hall's team included a resistance fighter who had worked on the tunnel's original construction 20 years earlier. He knew that the tunnel lining was thinnest at a specific point where geological conditions had allowed thinner concrete. The team placed charges against this weak point, using shaped charges that Hall had configured to direct blast energy into the concrete rather than dispersing it uselessly in all directions. The explosion brought down a section of the tunnel roof, blocking the passage with tons of rubble. Clearing the debris and repairing the damage required specialized mining equipment and weeks of dangerous work. German authorities diverted train traffic over mountain roads, using trucks, consuming scarce fuel, and reducing the tonnage they could move by 70% compared to rail transport. By early November 1943, Hall's campaign had destroyed or severely damaged 8 separate railway targets in a period of approximately 6 weeks. The exact time frame from first operation to last covered 43 days, close enough to the 40-day period that later accounts would use that figure. German military situation reports from the period, captured after the war and now held in National Archives, document the cumulative effect. Supply deliveries to Wehrmacht units in southern France fell by 30 to 40%. Ammunition shortages forced German commanders to ration artillery fire. Fuel shortages limited training exercises and patrols. Replacement parts for vehicles and equipment arrived weeks late or not at all. The reports also document German frustration at their inability to stop the sabotage. Security forces conducted hundreds of patrols, established checkpoints, arrested suspects, and executed hostages, but the attacks continued. The Germans never identified Hall specifically as the coordinator, though Gestapo files noted increased resistance activity in areas where the Limping Lady had previously operated. They assumed she was still in Spain or had returned to London. The possibility that a woman with a prosthetic leg was moving through occupied France, coordinating demolitions, and evading their security apparatus seemed too improbable to consider seriously. The cost of Hall's 40-day campaign was measured not in the tons of explosives used or the number of trains destroyed, but in the accumulated physical damage to her body and the psychological weight of responsibility for the retaliation her success provoked. The prosthetic leg that had initially seemed like a clever disguise became a source of constant agony during the extended operations. The leather socket, designed for normal civilian walking, was never intended for the kind of punishment Hall subjected it to during her sabotage campaign. Each operation required miles of cross-country movement, often at night over rough terrain. The prosthetic leg had no shock absorption, no flexibility, no give. Every step transmitted impact directly to the stump. The leather rubbed constantly, creating blisters that opened into weeping sores. In the damp autumn weather of central France, the sores refused to heal. They became infected, requiring Hall to clean and dress them with whatever antiseptic supplies she could obtain from resistance sympathizers who included rural doctors and pharmacists. The pain became so severe during November 1943 that Hall could barely walk without grimacing. She disguised the limp as best she could, but the effort required constant concentration. In one incident documented in her OSS reports, she was stopped at a German checkpoint while traveling between resistance cells. A Wehrmacht soldier questioned her papers, which identified her as a rural social worker visiting farms to check on elderly residents. The soldier noticed her difficulty walking and asked if she needed medical attention. Hall declined, saying she had twisted her ankle. The soldier accepted the explanation and waved her through. She walked a quarter-mile down the road before allowing herself to stop and rest, knowing that any sign of collapse within sight of the checkpoint would raise suspicions. The psychological burden was equally difficult. German retaliation for railway sabotage followed predictable patterns. After each attack, occupation authorities posted notices announcing that hostages would be executed in reprisal. The standard ratio was 10 French civilians executed for each German soldier killed or major act of sabotage committed. Hall's 8 operations had resulted in the execution of approximately 70 French hostages, men selected arbitrarily from villages near the sabotage sites, or from prisoners already held on suspicion of resistance activity. Hall understood the mathematics of guerrilla warfare. The strategic value of disrupting German supply lines outweighed the cost in hostage executions, particularly when measured against the thousands of French civilians who would die if the German war machine continued operating at full efficiency. She understood that refusing to conduct sabotage because the Germans would murder hostages in response meant surrendering to terrorist tactics and allowing the occupation to continue indefinitely. She understood these calculations intellectually and accepted them as operational necessity. But understanding necessity did not eliminate the emotional weight of responsibility. Each execution notice she saw posted in village squares represented specific human beings, fathers and sons and brothers, killed because of operations she had planned and coordinated. Some were resistance sympathizers who had knowingly accepted the risks. Most were ordinary civilians selected at random to terrorize communities into withdrawing support from the resistance. Hall kept moving, kept planning operations, kept teaching resistance fighters how to use explosives, but the cost accumulated in ways that were not visible in after-action reports. Her radio transmissions to OSS headquarters during this period, now declassified and available in the National Archives, show the strain in coded language. One message from late October 1943 reported successful completion of an operation, then added a request for guidance on whether continued sabotage justified the retaliation it provoked. The response from London was unequivocal. Continue operations. The strategic value outweighs the cost. The Germans will execute hostages regardless of whether sabotage occurs. Hall acknowledged the message and continued her campaign. The resistance fighters she worked with bore similar burdens. Many had families in the villages where German reprisals occurred. They participated in sabotage, knowing their actions might result in the execution of neighbors or relatives. Some refused to continue after witnessing executions. Others intensified their commitment, viewing each German reprisal as further evidence that accommodation with the occupation was impossible and that resistance, however costly, was morally necessary. Hall navigated these psychological complexities while maintaining operational security, managing supply logistics, and dealing with her own physical deterioration. By mid-November 1943, OSS headquarters ordered Hall to reduce her activity level. German security operations had intensified to the point where continued operations risked her capture, and her value as an experienced agent who knew SOE and OSS procedures made her too important to lose. She was instructed to focus on organizing resistance cells and training local leaders rather than personally coordinating sabotage operations. Hall complied reluctantly, recognizing that her effectiveness was diminishing as physical exhaustion and the cumulative stress of extended operations degraded her judgment and operational security. The strategic significance of Hall's railway sabotage campaign in the Haute-Loire becomes clear when viewed within the broader context of German logistics in France during late 1943. The Wehrmacht and German occupation authorities were facing increasing pressure on multiple fronts. Allied forces had invaded Italy in September, requiring continuous supply shipments to German divisions fighting to contain the advance. The Atlantic Wall fortifications along the French coast required massive quantities of concrete, steel, and labour. German industrial production was being disrupted by Allied strategic bombing. Partisan activity in the Balkans and Soviet advances on the Eastern Front were stretching German resources across a front that extended from Norway to North Africa. Railway capacity was the bottleneck that constrained everything else. The German rail network in occupied France handled approximately 15,000 freight trains per month in late 1943, carrying military supplies, industrial raw materials, food for garrison troops, and war material being shipped to various fronts. The system operated near maximum capacity, with minimal slack for disruptions. Every destroyed locomotive, every damaged bridge, every severed rail line created ripple effects that propagated throughout the network. Hall's 8 major sabotage operations, combined with dozens of smaller attacks by resistance groups she had trained and supplied, reduced railway capacity in central France by an estimated 30 to 40% during November and December 1943. This reduction translated directly into supply shortages for German combat units. Wehrmacht situation reports from this period, now available in historical archives, document the consequences. Artillery batteries in southern France reported ammunition shortages that forced rationing of fire support during combat operations. Tank units reported delays in receiving replacement parts for damaged vehicles. Infantry divisions reported food supply disruptions that required reducing rations. The cumulative effect of sustained railway sabotage extended beyond immediate supply shortages. It forced the German military to divert resources to railway security that would otherwise have been available for frontline service. Wehrmacht, security battalions, Luftwaffe field divisions, and even combat-experienced units recovering from frontline service were assigned to guard railway infrastructure. By early 1944, an estimated 50,000 German troops in France were engaged in security duties related to protecting railways, bridges, and supply depots from sabotage. These troops could not participate in offensive operations or reinforce units engaged in combat. When the Allied invasion of Normandy occurred in June 1944, German commanders found their ability to move reinforcements limited not only by Allied air superiority, but by the degraded railway infrastructure that resistance sabotage had systematically destroyed over the preceding months. Panzer divisions ordered to counterattack the Normandy beachheads took days to reach the front because rail movements were constantly disrupted by sabotage, requiring lengthy detours and road marches that consumed scarce fuel. Hall's specific contribution to this larger strategic picture was disproportionate to her physical presence. One agent, working with limited supplies and coordinating with resistance groups that numbered in the dozens rather than thousands, had created disruption that required the Germans to deploy thousands of security troops and accept significant supply constraints. The cost-benefit analysis from an Allied strategic perspective was overwhelmingly favourable. The resources invested in training Hall, infiltrating her into France, and supplying her operations totaled perhaps $50,000 in 1943 currency. The German resources she forced them to expend, measured in diverted troops, delayed supplies, and degraded military effectiveness, exceeded this investment by orders of magnitude. The broader lesson that Allied planners drew from Hall's success and similar operations by other SOE and OSS agents was that strategic sabotage by small, well-trained teams could achieve effects comparable to strategic bombing campaigns that required thousands of aircraft and crew members. This recognition influenced Allied strategy for the remainder of the war. Support for resistance movements increased, supply drops expanded, training programs for agents intensified. By mid-1944, resistance sabotage in France had become a systematic campaign coordinated with Allied military operations, with agents like Hall serving as the crucial link between London headquarters and local fighters. Hall herself received recognition that was necessarily delayed and muted by the requirements of wartime secrecy. She was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross in September 1945, the only civilian woman to receive the decoration during World War II. The citation noted her extraordinary heroism in conducting sabotage operations against German communications and supply lines while evading enemy security forces. The medal was presented in a private ceremony rather than the public events typical for such awards, because Hall's identity and methods remained classified. She declined public attention, returning to intelligence work after the war and maintaining operational security about her wartime activities until documents were declassified decades later. The fundamental irony of Virginia Hall's story lies not in the success of her sabotage campaign, but in the perceptions that made that success possible. The Gestapo and Wehrmacht security forces were searching for dangerous Allied agents throughout occupied France. They had photographs of Hall. They had descriptions of her appearance. They knew she walked with a pronounced limp due to a prosthetic leg. They considered her one of the most dangerous Allied operatives in France. Yet she operated for months in areas where German security presence was heavy, coordinating operations, training resistance fighters, and moving between safe houses with relative freedom. The contradiction was resolved by assumptions that seem obvious in hindsight but were invisible to German security personnel at the time. They were looking for dangerous agents. A middle-aged woman who walked with difficulty and had obvious physical limitations did not match their mental image of what a dangerous agent looked like. Agents were supposed to be physically capable, able to move quickly, able to fight if necessary. A woman with a prosthetic leg seemed to be exactly what she appeared to be. A civilian trying to navigate the difficulties of occupied France with a physical disability that limited her options and made her sympathetic rather than threatening. Hall exploited this perceptual gap systematically. She adopted cover identities that emphasized her disability rather than concealing it. She worked as a rural social worker, a role that explained why she traveled between villages and why she might be seen in areas where strangers would normally attract suspicion. She cultivated an appearance of harmlessness, dressing conservatively, moving slowly, appearing to struggle with the physical demands of daily life under occupation. German soldiers at checkpoints saw exactly what they expected to see, a disabled woman trying to get by. They did not see what was actually present, a highly trained intelligence officer coordinating military operations against their supply infrastructure. The prosthetic leg that initially seemed like a devastating liability became a form of protective camouflage more effective than any false identity papers or elaborate disguise. Hall could not run if pursued. She could not climb fences or move quickly across difficult terrain. But she also did not need to, because the Germans did not pursue her. They looked past her, searching for the dangerous agents they imagined must be hiding somewhere in the population, never recognizing that the limping woman they had questioned and released at the checkpoint was precisely the person they were seeking. This perceptual blindness reflected broader assumptions about disability, gender, and capability that were common in the 1940s, but that Hall exploited with calculated precision. The assumption that physical disability equated to incapability, that women were less dangerous than men, that middle-aged civilians were not threats. All these assumptions created operational space that Hall used to devastating effect. The Germans were correct that she was dangerous. They were wrong about almost everything else, and those errors cost them supply trains, bridges, locomotives, and the operational capacity those resources represented. The story of Hall's 40-day sabotage campaign is ultimately a story about the gap between appearance and reality, between perception and capability, between what observers think they see and what is actually present. It is a story about how assumptions based on physical appearance can blind observers to capabilities that are psychological, intellectual, and tactical rather than physical. It is a story about how a single, determined individual with proper training, adequate support, and the ability to exploit enemy assumptions can create strategic effects far beyond what their physical presence would suggest possible. For the resistance fighters, Hall-trained, and the French civilians who supported her operations, she represented something equally important. She demonstrated that resistance to occupation was possible even under conditions that seemed hopeless, that individuals with apparent limitations could contribute decisively to the struggle, and that the German military machine that seemed invincible could be disrupted and degraded through persistent, intelligent action. The psychological impact of successful sabotage extended beyond the immediate military effects. It showed occupied populations that they were not helpless, that collaboration was not inevitable, and that the occupation could be resisted through means other than open combat. The woman who limped through the darkness of the Haute-Loire Valley in September 1943, carrying 40 pounds of plastic explosives and suffering from infected sores where her prosthetic leg rubbed against the stump, proved something that military planners in London had hoped but could not confirm until she demonstrated it operationally. She proved that strategic sabotage by small teams could achieve disproportionate results, that physical disability did not preclude effective intelligence operations, and that the gap between enemy perceptions and operational reality could be exploited as decisively as any weapon in the Allied arsenal. Her 8 demolished trains, destroyed bridges, and crippled locomotives represented more than tactical successes. They represented the cost the Germans paid for their assumptions, for their failure to recognize that capability takes forms that are not always visible, and that the most dangerous opponents are sometimes the ones who appear least threatening. Virginia Hall walked with a limp. The Germans saw the limp and assumed they understood everything important about her. They were wrong, and that error cost them dearly in the struggle for control of occupied France. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.